Hello, my name is Kenneth Ramirez, and this is going to be a presentation on the Quartermaster Graves Registration Service. When students learn about the world wars, they generally learn about how the United States emerged as a global superpower, how the wars ended, why they began, who was on which side, along with other important takeaways, of which importance should not be taken away at all. But one aspect of war that never seems to be covered, yet seems so glaring when it is brought up, is what happens to all of the soldiers who die in those wars. In large World War battles especially, but not to exclude mass casualty battles in the Civil War, Spanish-American War, and other wars with high death tolls. The soldiers who were killed in battle had to be taken care of at some point, in some way. When there are so many deaths and bodies laying around a battle site, it is difficult to identify, individually bury, and notify the families of those bodies. So, what did we do with them? What happened to them? Who take care of them? Did they ever make it home to their families? All these questions are valid because, after all, dead men cannot bury themselves. While it is a tall task, it must be done. Hundreds and thousands of dead, sometimes more, that are not properly taken care of can cause disease, even damage the water supply of local towns, and when mass casualties decompose and sit in battlefields for long periods of time, they can damage the soil and be eaten by animals, which can also be diseased. In this photo, we see war horses being thrown into a mass grave. These were also part of the Quartermaster Graves Registration Service's responsibilities. This came to the attention of officials during the Civil War, where Americans saw mass amounts of casualties that simply needed better and more diligent care than was being provided. And eventually, Congress elected the Quartermaster General to be in charge of a national cemetery system in 1862. And while this was the beginning of the service, it did not serve the purpose it was meant to, and essentially, the U.S. Army was unable to fulfill the duties of identifying and burying the many fallen soldiers. Only between 50 and 60% of fallen soldiers were identified during the cleanup of battlefields during the Civil War. But nevertheless, more soldiers were being buried, and less were just being left because there was no organization set to take after them. It was realized by Americans, military men or not, that there was a need for an organization that was specially trained and fit for identifying and caring properly for the dead. It was not until the Spanish-American War conflict that the Quartermaster Department that had been created in 1912 finally employed a burial corps to take proper care of the dead. Identification of the dead rose by nearly 87%, and more soldiers were being returned to their families post-war. A pivotal point in the Graves registration history was the installment of Chaplain Charles C. Pierce as head of the morgue in the Quartermaster Department duties. Pierce set the precedent for identification procedures for soldiers that is the foundation of said procedures in modern militaries. Pierce formulated a plan of recording the data of fallen soldiers from physical appearance to wound details found on the soldiers' bodies. He also compared week and month-old bodies, etc., to form a better concept of causes of death and other identification processes that could be enhanced through this process. Pierce nearly identified every soldier, or at least their cause of death, while holding his position. Pierce also demanded that each soldier be buried in a brand new uniform, and worked with fellow soldiers to ensure embalming of them each for the return to their families post-war. In addition, Charles C. Pierce was the head of the decision to require the wearing of dog tags by all soldiers. This was implemented in 1917. Before dog tags were established, men who had fear of being marked unknown after the war wore pins with scraps of paper bearing their names attached to their uniforms. Others carried specific coins or small carved wood pieces and other tactics in order to assure that they were identified properly in the event of a casualty. The dog tag brought a sense of uniformity to the Army, and not only did it put the soldiers at ease, but it also marked a foundation for identifying fallen soldiers and maintaining a sense of structure for the Graves Registration Service, as well as representing a desire to further the attention to care for the dead. Chaplain Charles C. Pierce quoted, "It is better that all men should wear these marks as a military duty than one should fail to be identified." The Graves Registration Service was not only implemented with the intention to increase identification rates and better care for the dead, but also to create graves, as the name might imply. During the Great War, which would later be dubbed World War I, following the Second Great War, World War II, Theodore Roosevelt coined the expression, "Where the tree falls, let it lie," following the death of his own son, in reference to burying fallen soldiers where they had fallen in battle. The U.S. forces opted to let families choose whether to send their loved ones home following war deaths, or to bury them at the site of their death over in foreign nations. The Quartermaster Graves Registration Service created 8 cemeteries by the end of the Great War in Europe, creating a home for nearly 3,000 veterans killed in war. Others, around 44 to 47,000 others, were sent home to their families, in new uniforms obviously, and fully identified. One immensely and important, powerful service of the Graves Registration Service is the ability to create these cemeteries for fallen soldiers, and this was an exploited power during the Great War as these cemeteries were created. Creating these cemeteries was back-breaking work, however, and grunt work often slid down the totem pole to the African Americans and service troops. The Graves Registration also employed locals and German prisoners to help with the building of these cemeteries and the digging of all the graves. The Graves Registration Service upped the ante in the event of World War II, however, and Americans saw fallen soldiers spread across nearly 1.5 million square miles of foreign territory. The Graves Service faced a large task with new war technology, leaving some of the dead completely unrecognizable. Nevertheless, Graves registration companies spanned the war grounds and collected, evacuated, and identified the dead, as well as supervised their travel and/or burials. More than 250,000 Americans were buried in temporary cemeteries around the world during World War II. Quartermaster Graves registration companies were not only admirable because of the work they were doing and the care they took for veterans, but because of their sacrifice as well. It should not go unsaid that members of the Quartermaster Graves Registration Service did a lot of their work in severe and hazardous conditions, wartime conditions. One particular company assigned to the battle sites of D-Day showcased the ultimate sacrifice to take care of the fallen men of their country as they hurried to the beaches, searched the waters, and scoped the inland areas for soldiers. They even tore open and dragged bodies from a decimated watercrafts as well. One platoon alone buried 457 American dead, and combined the 3 platoons sent to Normandy were able to completely clear the beaches of all soldiers' remains. Following cleanup of D-Day in Normandy, Private Thomas J. Dowling of the 612th Graves Registration Company noted, "Not many of us were killed, but we died in different ways. The work was nightmarish, and it ate at our hearts, cracked some of us, darkened the spirits of others, and numbed the rest." The Quartermaster Graves Registration Service was not just in action in massive historical wars. America's most recent and longest large-scale war, the Vietnam War, showed further advancement of the U.S. military to take proper care of fallen military men and women. New technologies aid the identification of soldiers in fields such as dental and fingerprint ID methods. These would become extremely helpful. Especially, they would have been helpful in times where decimating war technology was preventing soldiers from being identified and sent home. Additionally, personal effects are now able to be transported home more often, and families receive more than just the battered body of their loved ones. as embalming and caring for veterans' bodies has improved as well. Methods have changed, and the Quartermaster Graves Registration Service is not at all what it used to be, but perhaps this is a good thing. It maintains the promise of caring for those who dedicate oneself to our country and continues to pledge that those men and women will return home, or at least be properly cared for and laid to rest wherever the families may wish. The Quartermaster Graves Registration Service embarked on a journey of grueling, gruesome, thankless work. But Private Thomas J. Dowling preaches that when we look at the lines of markers in one cemetery after another, we knew that if we were not doing this job, we would be letting down every soul back home. We did not have to like it, but it had to be done, so we made up our minds to do it right. And we did. These are my text references, academic journals, as well as articles from the U.S. Army and the History Channel, etc. My JSTOR articles are more historical. One talks specifically about certain units, and another talks about, the origins. The other articles talk more about, how grave of a task it really was, and talked about wartime conditions and such. And these are my electronic sources, pictures, videos, etc. All of these are relatively self-explanatory, but yeah, these are my electronic sources. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed.